I arrived at Christmas dinner with a cast on my foot and a recorder in my pocket. Everyone looked at me in horror when I told them my daughter-in-law had pushed me on purpose. My son laughed in my face and said I had that lesson coming. What they didn't know is that I had spent 2 months preparing my revenge, and that night every one of them would receive exactly what they deserved. But before I continue, make sure you are already subscribed to the channel and write in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love to know how far our stories are reaching. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I am 68 years old, and I learned the hard way that trust is something that is earned, not given freely just because someone came from your womb. It all started 3 years ago when my husband Richard passed away from a massive heart attack. It was 35 years of marriage, 3 decades building a life together, a bakery business that grew into a small chain with 4 locations in Chicago. Richard was the love of my life, my partner in everything. When he left, I felt as if half of me had been torn away. My only son, Evan, showed up at the wake with his wife, Chloe, and he hugged me too tightly for too long. At that moment, I thought it was comfort. Today, I know it was calculation. They were living in a rented apartment in Wicker Park, far from me, and came to visit maybe once a month. But after the funeral, they started showing up every week. Evan insisted I couldn't stay alone in the large house in Lincoln Park. He said he was worried about my mental health, my safety. Chloe agreed with everything, always with that sweet smile that I hadn't yet learned to read as false. I resisted at first, but the loneliness was heavy. The house that was once full of life with Richard now echoed with emptiness. So, I gave in. And just like that, 4 months after being widowed, Evan and Chloe moved into my house. They brought their things over little by little, occupying the guest room, then using the garage for her car, and eventually scattering their belongings into every corner of the house as if it had always been theirs. At first, I confess, it was comforting, having someone in the house, hearing voices, feeling movement. Evan would cook for me on the weekends. Chloe would join me at the farmer's market. It seemed like I had regained part of the family I lost with Richard's death. I was a fool. The inheritance Richard left was considerable. Besides the house, which was worth over $2 million, there were the 4 bakeries running well, generating monthly profits, and a robust savings account he had built over the years. In total, the estate was worth around $4 million. Evan was my only heir, but as long as I was alive, it was all mine. The first request for money came 6 months after they moved in. Evan approached me one Sunday afternoon while I was watering the plants in the garden. He had that expression I knew from childhood, when he wanted something but pretended to be embarrassed to ask. He told me the company where he worked was restructuring and he might be laid off. He needed $50,000 to invest in a specialization course that would guarantee him a better position. As a mother, how could I refuse? I transferred the money the next day. 3 weeks later, it was Chloe who appeared in my suite, all apologetic, saying her mother had health problems and needed $30,000 for a private surgery. I paid without question. After all, we were family now. The requests began to multiply. In September, another $40,000 for an investment Evan swore would double in 6 months. In October, $25,000 to fix Chloe's car after an accident. In November, another $30,000 for an unmissable partnership opportunity in a business that never materialized. By the time December arrived, I had already loaned them $230,000, and I hadn't seen a shadow of it returned. Every time I brought up the subject, Evan would deflect, promise we would sort it out soon, or simply change the conversation. I started to notice a pattern. They always asked when I was alone, always with stories that generated guilt or urgency. It was one Sunday morning that everything changed. I woke up early, as always, and went downstairs to make coffee. The house was still quiet. I put the water on to boil, and that's when I heard voices coming from their room. The hallway amplified the sound in a strange way, and I managed to hear every word with disturbing clarity. Chloe's voice came first, too casual for what she was saying. She asked when I was going to die. Just like that, as if she were asking what time it was. I felt my body go cold. Evan let out a nervous laugh and asked her not to talk like that. But Chloe continued, relentless. She said I was 68 years old, and I could easily live another 20 or 30, that they couldn't wait that long, that they needed to find a way to speed things up, or at least ensure that when I died, everything would pass directly to them without complications. My hand trembled so much I almost dropped the mug I was holding. I stood there, paralyzed by the stove, while my son and daughter-in-law discussed my death as if it were a logistical problem to be solved. Evan muttered something about me being his mother, but without any real conviction. Chloe shot back bluntly. She asked how much money they had already gotten out of me. Evan replied it was about $200,000, maybe a little more. And Chloe said they could still get another $100,000, $150,000 before I got suspicious. After that, she started talking about the will, about power of attorney, about the possibility of having me sign papers that would guarantee their control over my finances before I became senile. She used that word, senile, as if it were inevitable, as if it were only a matter of time. I went back up the stairs to my room with trembling legs. I locked the door for the first time since they had moved in. I sat on the bed I had shared with Richard for so many years and cried silently. I didn't cry from physical pain, but from the pain of realizing my only son saw me as a financial obstacle. That the woman he chose to marry was even worse, cold and calculating to the point of planning my demise with the same casualness as planning a vacation. That Sunday morning was the day Eleanor Hayes died. The naive woman who believed in family above all else, who blindly trusted her son, who saw kindness where there was only greed. She died right there, in that empty bed, and in her place, another Eleanor was born, one who knew how to defend herself, one who would not allow anyone else to treat me like an idiot. And that new Eleanor was about to show Evan and Chloe that they had chosen the wrong victim. I spent the following days observing. I didn't confront them. I didn't let on that I knew anything. I remained the same old Eleanor in front of them, the loving mother, the attentive mother-in-law, the lonely widow who depended on their company. But inside, I was assembling a puzzle. I started paying attention to details that had previously gone unnoticed. The way Chloe always appeared in the living room when the mailman brought correspondence from the bank. How Evan would look away when I mentioned the bakeries. The whispers that would stop abruptly when I entered a room. It all began to make sense, a sinister and painful sense. I decided I needed to understand the extent of the problem. I scheduled a meeting with Robert Mitchell, the accountant who had handled the bakery's finances since Richard's time. I made up an excuse about an end-of-year review and went alone to his office downtown. Robert was a serious man, in his 60s, who had always treated our business with discretion and efficiency. When I asked him to review all financial movements from the last year, both personal and business, he frowned, but didn't question it. What I discovered over the next 3 hours made me sick to my stomach. Besides the $230,000 I had consciously loaned them, there were regular withdrawals from the bakery's account that I had not authorized. Small amounts, $2,000 here, $3,000 there. Always on Thursdays when I had my yoga class and Evan stayed behind to sign some company documents. Robert pointed to the computer screen with a grave expression. He explained that in total, over the last 10 months, $68,000 had been diverted from the business accounts. Always with my digital signature, which Evan had access to as a proxy I had naively appointed to help me after Richard's death. I felt my blood boil. It wasn't just the loaned money that might never come back. It was pure, unadulterated theft. Systematic embezzlement of amounts they thought I wouldn't notice because I trusted them to help manage the businesses. I asked Robert to do 2 things immediately. Cancel any and all power of attorney Evan had over my accounts and businesses, and prepare a detailed report of all suspicious transactions. He suggested I consider filing a police report, but I asked him to wait. I didn't know exactly how I was going to handle this yet, but I wanted all the information first. On the way home, I stopped at a coffee shop and sat there for over an hour, drinking a tea that went cold without me touching it. My head was spinning with plans, with anger, with sadness. $298,000. That was the total Evan and Chloe had stolen from me, between unpaid loans and embezzlement from the companies. But the money, I realized, wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the betrayal. The worst part was looking at the son I raised, whom I held, whom I taught to walk, and knowing that he saw me as an income source, that he was waiting for me to die, that he was laughing at me behind my back while pretending to care. When I got home that afternoon, they were in the living room watching television. Chloe greeted me with that same fake smile and asked if I wanted anything special for dinner. Evan commented that I looked tired, showing concern like the devoted son he pretended to be. I told them I was fine, just a bit of a headache, and went up to my room. But before I went up, I turned and watched them both. Really watched them, perhaps for the first time since they moved in. I saw the way Chloe was curled up on the sofa, as if she owned the place. How Evan had his feet propped up on the coffee table that Richard had bought on a trip we took up the coast. How they occupied the space that was mine, that I had built, as if it were already theirs by right. That night, lying in bed, I made a decision. I wasn't going to just kick them out or confront them directly. That would be too easy, too quick. They had spent months manipulating me, stealing from me, planning my end. They deserved something more elaborate. They deserved a taste of their own medicine. I began my investigation the next day. While Evan was at work and Chloe was out meeting friends, I searched their room. I know it was an invasion of privacy, but at that point, I no longer cared about such moral subtleties. I found interesting things. A folder with copies of my old will, where I left everything to Evan. Notes on the estimated value of the house and the bakeries. Screenshots of conversations in a WhatsApp group called Plan E, where Chloe discussed with friends the best ways to get power of attorney from elderly people. One of her friends had recommended a lawyer who specialized in it. But what shocked me most was a notebook Chloe kept hidden in her lingerie drawer. It was a diary where she jotted down strategies to manipulate me. It had things written like, "Eleanor gets more emotional and generous after talking about Richard. Use that." Or, "Always ask for money when alone with her. Evan gets in the way by being weak." I read it with a mix of horror and rage. Every page was proof of how Chloe had studied my behavior, my weak spots, to better exploit me. She even noted the times I went out, the friends I saw, as if she were conducting surveillance. I took photos of everything with my phone. Every page of the notebook, every document in the folder, every screenshot. I saved everything in a hidden folder on my computer and in a cloud backup. If they wanted to play dirty, they would find out that I knew how, too. In the days that followed, I maintained my normal routine, but with hawk eyes. I realized Chloe would rummage through my mail when she thought I wasn't looking. I noticed Evan making whispered calls on the balcony. I saw the two of them exchange significant looks whenever I mentioned anything about health. One night at dinner, Chloe casually mentioned that a friend of hers had taken her mother to a very good geriatrician specializing in memory loss. She said it was important to get preventive checkups at my age. Evan agreed far too quickly, suggesting I should schedule an appointment. I pretended to consider the idea, but inside I was laughing. They were trying to plant the seed of the idea that I was becoming senile, creating a narrative to eventually have me declared incompetent. It was exactly the kind of move I had read about in Chloe's notebook. It was then that I had an idea. If they wanted to paint me as an idiot, I was going to play the part perfectly. I would give them exactly what they expected, a confused, vulnerable, increasingly dependent old woman. And while they believed they were winning, I would be building my trap. I started small. I pretended to forget little things. I'd ask the same question twice. I'd leave the pot on the stove longer than normal. Nothing too obvious, just enough to feed their narrative. Chloe took the bait immediately. She began commenting to Evan, just loud enough for me to hear, about my slip-ups. Evan also got in on the act, suggesting that maybe I needed help managing the bakery accounts because it was getting to be too much for me. On the outside, I nodded, feigning concern for myself. On the inside, I was documenting everything. I recorded conversations, noted dates and times, saved evidence. Every move they made was being registered. Every word was being archived. I also hired a private detective, discreetly. I wanted to know exactly what Evan and Chloe were doing when they weren't at home, who they were talking to, where they were going. The detective, an ex-cop named Marcus, was efficient and discreet. 2 weeks later, Marcus brought me a report that confirmed my worst suspicions and revealed things I couldn't even have imagined. Marcus met me at a coffee shop far from my neighborhood, far from any chance of running into Evan or Chloe. He brought a thick folder and an expression that mixed professionalism with pity. That alone told me the news wouldn't be good. The report began with the basics: Evan and Chloe's routine, places they frequented, people they met. But it quickly became clear there was much more going on than I knew. First, the apartment. They hadn't terminated their old lease as they claimed. In fact, they had renewed it and were using the place regularly, several times a week. Marcus had photos of them coming and going, always carrying expensive shopping bags, bottles of imported wine, boxes from high-end restaurants. Basically, they were living in my house for free, eating my food, using my utilities, but keeping the apartment as a secret hideaway where they lived a luxury lifestyle with the money they were stealing from me. The hypocrisy left me breathless. But there was more. Marcus had discovered that Chloe didn't work, contrary to what she always implied. The client meetings were actually afternoons at spas, expensive salons, and luxury malls. She was spending my money getting pampered like a socialite, while I, the true owner of the fortune, lived modestly. The report also revealed frequent meetings with a man named Julian Pierce. He was a lawyer specializing in family law and estates, particularly in cases of conservatorship and guardianship of the elderly. Marcus had managed to confirm, through a source at the firm, that Chloe had consulted Julian about the procedures to obtain legal guardianship over someone deemed incapacitated. My stomach churned. They weren't just stealing my money. They were actively preparing the ground to strip me of all legal control over my own life. They wanted to turn me into a legal prisoner, unable to make decisions, while they managed my fortune freely. Marcus turned another page, and his tone became even more serious. He had discovered something about Chloe's past that Evan probably didn't know. Before marrying my son, Chloe had been married to a 72-year-old man for only 11 months. The man had died of natural causes and had left a considerable inheritance to her. At the time, the deceased's family tried to contest the will, alleging Chloe had manipulated the elderly man, but they couldn't prove anything. She walked away with nearly $500,000, clean. 2 years later, she met Evan on a dating app. A young man, the only son of a wealthy widow. The coincidence was too disturbing to be ignored. I wasn't dealing with a common opportunistic daughter-in-law. I was dealing with someone who had experience in manipulating the elderly to get their inheritance, someone who had almost turned it into a profession. And my son, my Evan, was either a conscious accomplice or a useful tool in her hands. Marcus showed me photos of this Julian. A man in his 40s, well-dressed, with that air of someone who knows exactly how the system works and how to exploit it. Apparently, he had a history of helping families obtain guardianship over elderly relatives, always for exorbitant fees. His firm specialized in that lucrative and morally questionable niche. I asked Marcus to continue investigating, especially focusing on any contact between Chloe and people from her first marriage and any suspicious financial movements. He agreed and promised to have more information in 2 weeks. I left that coffee shop with the report hidden in my purse and crystal clarity in my mind. Chloe wasn't just an opportunist who saw a chance and took it. She was a professional predator who had chosen my son, and through him, me, as deliberate targets. And Evan, my own blood, had accepted that role, whether out of greed, weakness, or a combination of both. I couldn't have dinner with them that night. I faked a headache and went up early. But I actually stayed in my room, analyzing every page of Marcus's report, connecting the dots, understanding the full extent of the trap I had fallen into. They had a long-term plan. First, empty my accounts through loans and embezzlement. Second, create a narrative of my mental decline. Third, use Julian to obtain legal conservatorship. And then, with total control over my finances and my person, turn me into an empty shell while they lived off my fortune until I died naturally or, who knows, with a little help. The memory of the conversation I'd overheard about when I was going to die and if they could speed things up took on a new, more sinister weight. With Chloe's history of an elderly husband who died conveniently early, it wasn't paranoia to consider she might be planning something similar for me. I made a decision right then and there. I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to counterattack. I was going to use every piece of information I had, every piece of evidence Marcus gathered, every mistake they made, to turn the tables on them completely. When I was done with them, Evan and Chloe would understand the true meaning of messing with the wrong person. I started with the obvious, changing my will. I scheduled a meeting with my trusted lawyer, Arthur Vance, who had handled the bakery's legal affairs for years. I went to his office on a day Evan was traveling for work, and Chloe had supposedly gone to visit her mother. Arthur received me with his usual care, offering coffee and asking about my health. When I explained that I wanted to make significant changes to the will, he took pen and paper with an attentive expression. First, I removed Evan as the universal heir. In his place, I divided my assets so that the bakeries and half the money would go to a charitable foundation that helps disadvantaged children. The house and the other half of the money would go to my nephew, Ryan, my late sister's son, a serious and hard-working young man who had always kept in touch with me without any financial interest. Evan would inherit only a symbolic amount of $100,000, enough so he couldn't contest the will by claiming he was forgotten, but small enough to make my dissatisfaction clear. And I left an explanatory letter, sealed, to be opened only after my death, detailing the reasons for my decision. Arthur asked a few questions, making sure I was lucid and certain of the decision. I explained superficially that there had been trust issues without going into detail. He was professional enough not to press, only ensuring that everything would be done according to the law and kept in absolute confidence. I also took the opportunity to draw up a healthcare power of attorney, naming my best friend, Sarah, as the person responsible for making medical decisions for me in case I became incapacitated. Any attempt by Chloe and Evan to have me committed or medicated against my will would now hit that legal barrier. I left the law office feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. It was only the first step, but an important one. Now, even if the worst happened to me, they wouldn't get what they wanted. All the planning, all the manipulation would be for nothing. But I didn't intend for the worst to happen. I intended to be alive and well to see their faces when they found out they had lost everything. November arrived with that stifling humidity, typical of a Chicago fall. It had been almost 4 months since I'd discovered the truth about Evan and Chloe, and I had used every day of that time to build my case against them. Marcus continued to bring me information. We discovered that Chloe was meeting regularly with Julian, the lawyer, always at the secret apartment they kept. We even managed to get photos of them entering the building together and audio recordings proving they were preparing documentation to request my conservatorship. In one of those recordings, I heard Julian explaining to Chloe that they needed medical expert opinions to prove my mental decline. He suggested they get me to a specific doctor, someone who worked with him and was willing to diagnose cognitive problems for an extra fee. It was blatant corruption, a well-oiled scheme to defraud the legal system. Chloe asked how long it would take. Julian replied that with the right documents, including witness statements about my erratic behavior, they could have the conservatorship approved in 2 or 3 months. From then on, they would have total control over my finances and personal decisions. The coldness with which they discussed this, as if it were any other business deal, sent shivers down my spine. But it also gave me clarity. I wasn't facing people with an ounce of conscience or remorse. I was facing criminals, pure and simple. I decided it was time to start tightening the noose. But I needed to do it strategically, without showing all my cards at once. I started with small tests. One Thursday at dinner, I casually mentioned that I was thinking of selling one of the bakeries, the one with the lowest profits, I said, to simplify my life. Evan almost choked on his food. Chloe became visibly tense. They spent the rest of the meal trying to convince me it was a terrible idea, that I was confused, that the bakeries were my legacy, and I would regret it. Their concern had nothing to do with me, of course. They were terrified at the idea of me selling assets before they could get control of them. I let the subject drop naturally, saying I'd think about it. But I watched how agitated they were in the following days. Chloe made urgent calls, probably to Julian. Evan started questioning me more about my finances, disguised as a concerned son. 2 weeks later, I dropped another bomb. I said I had scheduled a consultation with a lawyer to discuss updating my will. Their reaction was even more intense. They immediately asked which lawyer, why I thought it was necessary, if something was worrying me. I lied, saying it was just a routine review that Arthur Vance had suggested. They insisted on coming with me for support. I politely declined, saying I needed to do it alone, that it was important for me to maintain some independence in my decisions. That night, after I pretended to go to sleep, I sat in the dark corner of the hallway and listened to them arguing in their room. They were panicking. Chloe was saying they needed to accelerate the process of the conservatorship, that I was starting to do things that could compromise their plan. Evan agreed but seemed hesitant, worried if they would get enough proof. Chloe then suggested something that froze my blood. She said that maybe they needed to create some evidence, make me seem more confused than I actually was. Evan asked how. She replied that there were ways. Medication mixed into her food could cause temporary mental confusion. Small accidents could create the impression that she's losing her physical and mental capabilities. I heard that and felt, for the first time, real fear. They weren't just planning to rob me. They were willing to drug me, to hurt me, to deliberately destroy my health to achieve their goals. I went back to my room with trembling legs and, for the first time in months, I truly cried. I cried for the loss of the son I thought I had. I cried for my naivety in trusting them. But mostly, I cried with rage. A deep, cold rage that settled in my chest and didn't leave. The next day, I called Marcus and told him about the conversation. He went serious and said we needed to involve the police, that this had crossed the line from simple financial fraud to planning an assault. But I asked him to wait. I had a better plan. If Chloe wanted to make me look confused, I would give her exactly that, but in a controlled, documented way that would ultimately backfire on her. I began to play the role of the old woman losing her mind, but in an exaggerated, almost theatrical way. I'd pretend to forget where I put things, only to find them in front of them in obvious places. I'd ask the same question twice in a row, but always about unimportant matters. I'd leave lights on, doors open, empty pots on the stove. Nothing dangerous, but all very visible. And most importantly, I documented everything. I installed hidden cameras at strategic points in the house, small, discreet, recording everything in high definition and automatically saving to the cloud. Every move they made, every conversation, every conspiratorial glance was being recorded. Chloe took the bait with veracity. She started inviting friends over, always when I was nearby doing something confused. They would witness my lapses, my disorganization, and Chloe would narrate it all with that fake, worried voice. I knew she was building her network of witnesses. What she didn't know was that my cameras were capturing the conversations after I left the room. They captured Chloe, telling her friends I was worse than I looked, that I couldn't take care of myself anymore, that they would need to take legal steps soon. They captured the laughter when they thought I couldn't hear, the comments about how great it would be when they had access to all the money. Evan also got in on the act, but in a different way. He started bringing documents home, papers from the bakeries that needed my signature. Only now, he would review every signature I made, comparing it with previous ones, looking for signs of tremors or lack of coordination that he could use as proof of my decline. So, I started signing some things with my hand trembling on purpose. Other times, I'd sign perfectly. I wanted to create inconsistency, to give them hope but never total certainty. Watching them get frustrated trying to figure out my real state was almost satisfying. But everything changed one afternoon in December, 3 weeks before Christmas. I had gone to the supermarket to get groceries. Returning, with bags in my hand, I climbed the 3 steps to the entrance of the house, as I had for 20 years. Only this time, I felt something push me from behind. It wasn't an accidental stumble. It was a deliberate, hard shove, with 2 hands extended into my back. I lost my balance completely, the bags flew, and I fell sideways onto the concrete steps. The pain was immediate and excruciating. I felt something snap in my right foot on impact. I screamed, more from shock than pain, and tried to turn to see who had pushed me. It was Chloe. She was standing there at the top of the stairs with an expression that wasn't shock or concern. It was cold satisfaction. Our eyes met for a second, and in that second, I saw everything. She had done it on purpose. She had deliberately pushed me, calculating that the fall would injure me. Before I could say anything, I heard quick footsteps. Evan appeared from inside the house. He looked at me on the ground, looked at Chloe, and then he did something that broke the last piece of my heart that still held out hope for him. He laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh of surprise. It was a genuine laugh, of approval, almost of pride. And then, he said, in a voice I had never heard come from my son's mouth, something that would be burned into my memory forever. You had that lesson coming. I lay there, crumpled on the steps, my foot throbbing in agony, looking at the man I gave birth to, carried for 9 months, raised with all the love I had, and listened to him tell me I deserved to be assaulted, that I deserved to be hurt, that this was a lesson. Chloe calmly walked down the steps, picked up the groceries that had spilled, and went into the house as if nothing had happened. Evan stayed there a second longer, the smirk still on his face, before following his wife. They left me there. They didn't call for help. They didn't offer support. They showed not an ounce of remorse. They simply abandoned me at the entrance of my house, with a broken foot, as if I were disposable trash. It was my neighbors who found me. Mrs. Peterson, who lives 3 houses down, was coming back from the pharmacy and saw me. She yelled for help, called her husband, and together they helped me into their car to take me to the hospital. On the way, with the pain pulsing up my leg and silent tears streaming down my face, I made a choice. This had been their final mistake. The mistake that would transform all my pain, all my anger, all my planning into concrete action. They had crossed the line from psychological manipulation to physical violence, and that changed everything. In the emergency room, while waiting to be seen, I called Marcus. I explained what had happened. He was silent for a moment. Then he asked if I was absolutely certain it was on purpose. I replied that I was, that Chloe had pushed me deliberately and Evan had approved it, saying it was a lesson I deserved. Marcus then said something that surprised me. He asked if there were cameras at the entrance of the house, and that's when I remembered. The external camera I had installed weeks ago, hidden in the porch light, aimed exactly at the steps. If it was working, it had recorded everything. The push, the fall, their reaction, Evan's words. Everything. I asked Marcus to go to my house, with some excuse, and discreetly check if the camera had captured the incident. He said he would go immediately. 2 hours later, sitting in a wheelchair with my right foot in a cast up to my knee, I received a text from Marcus. Just 2 words and an emoji. We got it. The camera had worked perfectly. It had recorded Chloe looking around before pushing me, checking for witnesses. It had recorded the push itself, deliberate and hard. It had recorded my fall and my scream. And most importantly, it had recorded Evan laughing and saying those monstrous words. It was irrefutable proof of intentional physical assault, and I intended to use every second of that recording to completely destroy their plans. The doctors said my foot was fractured in 2 places. I would need surgery to put in pins, followed by months of physical therapy. I was admitted that night for surgery the next morning. Evan and Chloe showed up at the hospital 2 hours later. Chloe was carrying flowers and an expression of concern that would have won an Oscar. Evan held my hand and talked about how worried he was, how they had panicked when the neighbors told them about my fall. My fall, as if I had tripped on my own. I let them act. I let Chloe stroke my hair and say she would take care of me during my recovery. I let Evan promise he wouldn't leave my side. And inside, I planned every detail of what was to come. Because in 2 days it would be Christmas, and this was going to be a Christmas dinner none of us would ever forget. The surgery on my foot was successful, but painful. They placed 2 titanium pins and told me I'd need to wear the cast for at least 6 weeks, followed by intense physical therapy. I was discharged on the afternoon of December 23rd, the day before Christmas Eve. Chloe made a point of picking me up from the hospital, bringing a wheelchair they had rented, and acting like the devoted daughter-in-law she never was. On the way home, she talked non-stop about how she had prepared my room, how she had bought special pillows to elevate my leg, how she was going to take care of every detail of my recovery. I just nodded, letting the pain medication give me an excuse to be quiet. But I watched everything. The way she took turns too fast, making my foot bang against the dashboard and hurt more. The glances she shot me in the rearview mirror not of concern, but of calculation. She was measuring my fragility, my dependence, seeing how far she could push me now that I was literally injured. When we got home, Evan was waiting at the door. He helped me out of the car and into the wheelchair with careful gestures, but his eyes were empty. There was no love there, no genuine filial concern, just the performance of a role he had chosen to play. They settled me in my room, and Chloe brought me soup. I didn't eat it. I said the hospital medication had ruined my appetite. The truth was, I didn't trust anything that came from her hands. Not after the conversation I overheard about putting medication in my food. The soup could have been perfectly normal, but I wasn't taking any chances. That night, alone in my room with the door locked, I called Marcus. He told me he had compiled all the camera recordings from the last 2 months. We had hours of footage showing suspicious conversations, meetings with Julian, discussions of their plans, and, crucially, the crystal-clear recording of the assault on the stairs. I told him my plan for Christmas dinner. He was silent for a moment, then asked if I was sure. This was going to blow up my family in a way there was no coming back from. I replied that my family had already blown up the moment my son laughed at my pain and said I deserved to be hurt. What I was going to do on Christmas was just make it official. Marcus agreed to help. He said he would coordinate with the police, that we would need officers present at just the right moment. He also contacted Arthur Vance, my lawyer, and Robert, the accountant. Everyone needed to be aware of what was about to happen. On the 24th, Christmas Eve, the house was strangely tense. Chloe had decorated excessively, as if the sheer number of ornaments could create the illusion of a happy family. Evan had bought an expensive turkey and imported wines. They were planning a big celebration, and I knew why. They thought they had won. That with my broken foot, physically dependent on them, more fragile and vulnerable than ever, they finally had me where they wanted me. The assault hadn't just been gratuitous violence. It had been strategic, to make me an invalid, dependent, easier to control. What they didn't know was that they had only accelerated their own destruction. On Christmas morning, Chloe came into my room, all cheerful. She said they had prepared a special lunch, that they had even invited a few people. I asked who. She listed the names. A few of her friends, the same ones who had come over to witness my supposed moments of confusion. And surprisingly, Julian, the lawyer. I felt a chill. They were going to use Christmas Day, with witnesses present, to create another episode of my supposed incapacity. They were probably planning some scene where I would appear confused or incapable, right in front of the lawyer who would prepare the conservatorship papers. I told Chloe I felt well enough to join the lunch. She seemed overly pleased by that. She helped me get ready, picking out clothes for me as if I were a child, and wheeled me into the living room. The table was set in an exaggerated fashion. Too much food, too many decorations, too much of everything. Chloe's friends were already there, all greeting me with that fake pity people show when they think you're losing your mind. Julian arrived shortly after, a man in an expensive suit and a professional smile. Evan made the introductions. He introduced Julian as a family friend, a lawyer who's helping out with some legal matters. Julian shook my hand with measured firmness and told me he'd heard a lot about me. I'll bet you have. Lunch began with the typical nervousness of a forced celebration. Chloe served the food. Evan opened the wine. The friends chatted about trivialities. And I watched, waiting. It didn't take them long to start. Chloe casually mentioned that I had gotten confused that morning, trying to leave my room without the wheelchair. One of her friends commented on how hard it must be for me to accept my limitations. Another agreed, saying her grandmother had gone through the same phase of denial when she started to lose her faculties. Julian listened to it all with professional attention, asking subtle questions about my routine, my memory, my ability to make decisions. It was an interrogation disguised as casual conversation, and everyone at the table knew it, except, apparently, me. It was then that I decided to begin my own performance. I pretended to be confused about where I was, asking if it was time for Easter lunch. Chloe exchanged significant looks with Julian. One of the friends sighed with pity. Evan gently corrected me, saying it was Christmas, not Easter. I feigned surprise, then embarrassment. I said my foot hurt, and the medication made me foggy. Julian discreetly jotted something down in a small notebook. I continued like this throughout the meal, moments of clarity interspersed with apparent confusion. Nothing too exaggerated, just enough to feed the narrative they wanted to build. And every second was being recorded by the cameras they didn't know existed. After lunch, when everyone was in the living room having coffee, pretending to celebrate, my moment arrived. I looked at the clock. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the time I had arranged with Marcus. I pulled myself up from the wheelchair with difficulty, leaning on the crutch the doctors had given me. Everyone stopped talking and looked at me. Chloe stood up quickly, moving toward me with that mask of concern. That's when the doorbell rang. The silence in the room was absolute. Evan and Chloe looked at each other, confused. They weren't expecting anyone else. I offered to get it, but Chloe said she would, that I should sit down. I just smiled and said I would get it myself. After all, it's my house. I walked slowly to the door, leaning on the crutch, feeling all eyes on my back. I opened the door calmly. On the other side stood 2 uniformed police officers, Marcus and Arthur Vance, my lawyer. I turned back to the living room, where everyone was frozen, processing the scene. And then I said, in a voice firmer and clearer than I had used in months, "Officers, please come in. I have a report to file." The silence that followed was dense, heavy, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. I saw the color drain from Chloe's face. Her eyes went wide as the police officers stepped inside. Evan stood frozen, his mouth open, unable to form words. Chloe's friends looked at each other in confusion. Julian, the lawyer, immediately adopted a defensive posture, closing his notebook and crossing his arms. The lead officer, Commander Silva, a man in his 50s with a commanding presence, entered the room, examining each person present. Behind him, Marcus carried a laptop, and Arthur Vance held a thick folder of documents. I excused myself and returned to my wheelchair, not because I needed it, but because the visual drama of the moment was worth every second. A 68-year-old woman, foot in a cast, a visible victim of violence, reporting her own family on Christmas Day. It was an image that would be seared into the memory of everyone present. Commander Silva introduced himself formally and asked who Evan Hayes and Chloe Hayes were. My son and daughter-in-law identified themselves with trembling voices. One of Chloe's friends stood up nervously, saying perhaps it was best if they left, but the commander kindly asked everyone to remain seated. It was then that I began to speak. My voice came out firm, unwavering, completely different from the confused woman I had been portraying during lunch. I explained that over the past few months, I had been the victim of systematic financial embezzlement, totaling approximately $300,000. That my son and daughter-in-law had gained access to my accounts through a power of attorney I granted them, trusting them after my husband's death. That they had used that access to steal money from both my personal accounts and the businesses I managed. Evan tried to interrupt, saying they were family loans, misunderstandings. The commander asked him to wait his turn to speak. I continued. I said I had discovered through a private investigation that they were maintaining a secret apartment paid for with my money, where they lived a life of luxury while living in my house for free. That Chloe had a history of marrying an elderly man who died conveniently, leaving her his inheritance. That they had hired a lawyer specializing in conservatorship to have me declared mentally incompetent. Julian tried to protest, saying he didn't know what I was talking about, that he was just providing legal consultation. Arthur Vance opened his folder and produced copies of emails between Julian and Chloe discussing the exact procedures for having me committed. The lawyer turned pale, but the worst part, I continued, was that after discovering I was investigating, they had begun planning ways to drug me to create false evidence of mental decline, and that 3 days ago, my daughter-in-law had deliberately pushed me down the stairs, breaking my foot. Chloe exploded. She screamed that I had fallen on my own, that I was delirious, that the medication was making me paranoid. Her friends agreed, saying I clearly wasn't well, that my entire behavior during lunch demonstrated confusion. That's when Marcus opened the laptop. On the large screen he connected to the living room television, the recording from the external camera began to play. Everyone could see, in high definition, Chloe looking around, checking if anyone was watching. Then, with deliberate, clear movements, placing both hands on my back and pushing me with force. The entire room watched my fall, heard my scream of pain. And then they watched and heard Evan walk out of the house, look at me on the ground, and laugh. His voice came clearly from the speakers. You had that lesson coming. The silence that followed was absolute. One of Chloe's friends brought her hand to her mouth, horrified. Another began to cry softly. Julian discreetly distanced himself from Chloe, as if physical proximity could contaminate him. Chloe stared at the screen. She looked at me. She looked at the police, processing the fact that she had been recorded. Evan was white as a sheet, staring at his own hands as if he didn't recognize the man who had laughed at his own mother's fall. But Marcus wasn't finished. He began to play other recordings, conversations between Evan and Chloe about accelerating my death, discussions about putting medication in my food, the audio of the consultation with Julian about the conservatorship proceedings, the visits to the secret apartment. Every video, every audio clip was a hammer blow to any defense they might try to build. There was no way to deny it, no way to justify it. It was all there, recorded, time-stamped, authenticated. When the videos finished, Commander Silva addressed Evan and Chloe. He said they were being arrested for aggravated battery, in Chloe's case, and for conspiracy and threat in Evan's case. That other crimes would be investigated, including embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Chloe tried to run. She literally tried to bolt through the kitchen door, but one of the officers intercepted her easily. She began to scream, saying I had planned everything, that I had faked the evidence, that I was trying to steal the inheritance that was theirs by right. The irony of her words was lost on no one in the room. Evan, on the other hand, collapsed. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and began to cry. They weren't tears of remorse, I realized. They were tears of self-pity, from a man who had thrown everything away for greed and had lost. The police handcuffed them. Chloe continued to scream, fighting against the cuffs, hurling threats and insults. Evan just cried silently, his face hidden in his hands. Before they took them away, Commander Silva asked if I wanted to say anything. I looked at my son, the man I had carried, raised, loved unconditionally for 28 years. The man who had laughed when he saw me fallen, injured, bleeding, and I said only one thing. You are no longer my son. Not from the moment you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive. Evan looked at me, his eyes red from crying, and tried to speak. He tried to say he was sorry, that he had been influenced, that he never wanted it to go this far. But I raised my hand, silencing him. There was nothing he could say that would change what he had done. There was no excuse, no justification, no possible forgiveness for someone who plans their own mother's death. The police took them away. Chloe was still screaming in the hallway, her voice echoing through the house until the squad car door shut. Evan left in silence, head bowed, defeated. Chloe's friends scurried out, muttering apologies, probably already imagining how they would explain to others that they had witnessed an arrest at Christmas lunch. Julian tried to slip out discreetly, but Arthur Vance intercepted him, saying the State Bar Association would be notified of his involvement in the fraudulent scheme. When everyone finally left and the house fell silent, I found myself alone in the living room, surrounded by the remnants of a Christmas lunch that never became a celebration. The cold turkey on the table, the half-finished wine, the dessert plates no one had touched. Marcus stayed with me. He sat beside me and asked if I was okay. I answered honestly. I didn't know. Part of me felt immense relief. The threat had been neutralized, my safety was guaranteed, justice would be served. But another part of me, the part that was still a mother despite everything, ached in a way no broken bone could compare to. Because even knowing Evan didn't love me, even with proof of his betrayal, it was still hard to accept that I had lost my son. Not to death, but to something much worse, to the greed that had transformed him into a cruel stranger. Arthur Vance returned an hour later with papers for me to sign. Documents formalizing the criminal complaint, authorizations to proceed with the full investigation, and confirmation that the new will was filed and protected. I signed everything with a steady hand, without hesitation. That night, for the first time in months, I slept deeply. Not because I was happy, but because I was safe. The monster that had been living in my own house had been removed. The threat to my life was over. Tomorrow, the legal process would begin, the hearings, the testimonies. It would be long, it would be painful, it would be public. But I was ready, because Eleanor Hayes was no longer the naive, trusting widow she had been. She was a survivor, and survivors don't give up. The days following Christmas were a whirlwind of legal activity and media attention I had not expected. The story of a mother being assaulted and robbed by her own son and daughter-in-law caught the attention of local papers, then larger news portals. Reporters camped out in front of my house, asking for interviews, wanting details. Marcus advised me not to speak to the press until the legal process was more advanced. Arthur Vance agreed, saying any public statement could be used by Evan and Chloe's defense. So I remained silent, which only fueled public curiosity. What we discovered in the following weeks, as the police dug deeper into the investigation, went far beyond what I had imagined. Chloe hadn't just had one previous husband who died conveniently. She'd had two. The first, whom no one knew about because she used a different maiden name at the time, had been a 65-year-old businessman who died of a heart attack just 6 months after their wedding. She inherited an apartment and nearly $200,000. The second husband, the one I already knew about, the 72-year-old, had left even more. Combined, Chloe had inherited over $1 million from two elderly husbands who died in circumstances that, while officially natural, were statistically very convenient. The police reopened both cases for investigation. They exhumed bodies, reviewed medical reports, interviewed families, and they began to find patterns. In both cases, the men had been healthy until they met Chloe. After marriage, they quickly developed heart problems, uncontrolled hypertension, and episodes of confusion that resulted in falls and accidents. A toxicologist was called in to review the old reports. He pointed out that the symptoms were consistent with gradual poisoning by certain medications that, in small, regular doses, would cause exactly the problems Chloe's husbands had developed. They were substances difficult to detect in routine autopsies, especially when doctors already expected to find heart problems due to age. When they told me this, I felt a shiver down my spine, because I realized just how close I had come to being the third victim. If I hadn't discovered the plan in time, if I hadn't stopped eating the food Chloe prepared, perhaps my obituary would now be in the papers as a natural death from health complications. Evan was also being investigated more deeply. They discovered he had gambling debts he had hidden from me. Nearly $100,000 owed to loan sharks, incurred even before he met Chloe. When Chloe entered his life with her inheritance money, it must have seemed like the perfect solution, and when her money ran out, I became the next target. The prosecution built a solid case. Aggravated battery charges for Chloe, fraud for both, conspiracy, and for Julian, the lawyer, participation in a fraudulent scheme. The penalties, if they were convicted, could reach 15 years for Chloe and 10 for Evan. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for February. Arthur Vance prepared me extensively. He said I would be called to testify, that the defense would try to discredit me, painting me as a vindictive and controlling mother who invented accusations because she couldn't accept that her son had grown up and formed his own family. When the day came, I was nervous but prepared. The courtroom was packed. Part of Chloe's family, who believed in her innocence, filled half the seats. The other half was filled with press and curious onlookers. I entered on crutches, my still-casted foot serving as a visual reminder of the violence I had suffered. Evan and Chloe were already there, seated with their lawyers. Evan looked at me as I entered, and for the first time, I saw something resembling real shame in his eyes. Chloe, on the other hand, stared at me with pure hatred. There were no more masks, no more sweet, attentive daughter-in-law. It was just raw, naked rage. The judge, Judge Henry Campos, a man in his 60s with a reputation for severity, called the session to order. He asked the prosecution to present its case. DA Patricia Mendez, the assigned prosecutor, was a competent woman in her 40s with experience in elder abuse crimes. She laid out the case meticulously, showed the financial evidence, the embezzlement, the unpaid loans, the secret apartment. She presented the audio of the conversations about accelerating my death, about drugging me, about obtaining a fraudulent conservatorship. And finally, she played the video of the assault on the stairs. The entire courtroom watched in silence as the recording showed Chloe pushing me and Evan laughing, saying it was a lesson I deserved. I saw some people in the gallery shake their heads in disapproval. An older woman, who I later found out was Chloe's aunt, began to cry softly. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand with difficulty. The judge offered to let me remain seated for the entire testimony, given my physical condition. I accepted gratefully. D.A. Mendez asked me direct questions. When did I discover the embezzlement? How did I feel when I heard my son and daughter-in-law planning my death? What happened on the stairs on December 22nd? I answered everything calmly, without dramatization, just stating the facts. I explained that I had trusted them completely, that I had given my son power of attorney after my husband's death, because I believed he would help me, that I never imagined that trust would be used to systematically steal from me. I told them about the morning I overheard the conversation, about the coldness with which they discussed how much longer I would live, about the fear I felt when I realized I wasn't safe in my own home, and finally, about the physical and emotional pain of being deliberately assaulted by my daughter-in-law while my son approved. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my face. They weren't planned, they weren't a performance. It was real pain, real grief for the family I thought I had, which I discovered was an illusion. Chloe's lawyer, Carlos Furtado, an aggressive man known for intimidation tactics, began the cross-examination. He tried to paint me as controlling, asking if I didn't have difficulty accepting that Evan was an adult and had a right to his own life. If it wasn't possible that my interpretation of the conversations I heard was distorted by my emotional state after being widowed, I replied patiently that being in mourning didn't make me deaf or incapable of understanding plain English. That hearing someone say, "When is the old woman going to die? We can't wait 30 years," didn't leave much room for interpretation. He then suggested that perhaps I had fallen on my own on the stairs and, in my confused state, documented by the witnesses at lunch, had created a false narrative of assault. That the video only showed Chloe near me, not necessarily pushing me. D.A. Mendez objected immediately, asking for the video to be played again, frame by frame. And there, for all to see, it was clear. Chloe's hands, extended onto my back, pushing with enough force to move my entire body forward. There was no ambiguity, no alternative interpretation. It was a clear, deliberate assault. Evan's lawyer, a younger man named Rafael Acosta, tried a different approach. He suggested my son had been manipulated by Chloe, that she was the real criminal, that Evan was essentially another victim, seduced by a calculating woman who had a history of exploiting the elderly. I looked at Evan as the lawyer said this. My son kept his eyes down, neither confirming nor denying. Part of me wanted to believe that narrative. I wanted to think my boy had been tricked, manipulated, led down the wrong path by a malignant influence. But then I remembered the laugh, the way he had laughed when he saw me fallen, bleeding, with a broken foot, the way he said I deserved that lesson. That wasn't manipulation, that was cruelty coming from within him, from a dark place that was perhaps always there, and I had just never wanted to see it. When the judge asked if I had anything else to declare before finishing my testimony, I asked for permission to speak directly to my son. The judge hesitated but finally agreed. I looked at Evan. He finally raised his eyes and met my gaze, and I said, in a voice that came out firmer than I expected, "Evan, for 28 years, I loved you unconditionally. I gave you everything I could. Love, education, opportunities, trust. When your father died, you were the most important person in my life, and you took all of that and turned it into a weapon against me. Not out of need, not out of desperation, but out of pure greed. You stole from me, you betrayed me, you laughed at my pain. So, no, you are not a victim of anyone but your own choices, and you will have to live with them for the rest of your life." Evan began to cry. They were no longer tears of self-pity, I realized. They were tears from someone who finally understood the magnitude of what he had lost. Not the money, not the inheritance, but something far more precious, his own mother's love. The judge ended my participation and called other witnesses. Robert, my accountant, confirmed the financial diversions with detailed documentation. Marcus presented the full results of his investigation. Even neighbors were called to testify about changes in my behavior, confirming I had always been lucid and capable, debunking the mental decline narrative Chloe and Evan had tried to build. The toxicologist who reviewed the cases of Chloe's previous husbands also testified, presenting analyses that strongly suggested gradual poisoning. The defense tried to discredit his conclusions, but the evidence was technical, scientific, and hard to refute. The hearing lasted 3 full days. At the end, the judge determined there was sufficient cause for a full trial. He denied bail for Chloe, citing her as a flight risk and a danger to witnesses, especially me. For Evan, he granted a high bail $500,000, which he had no way of paying. Both would remain in jail until the trial. When I left the courthouse that last day, reporters surrounded me. This time, Marcus and Arthur agreed I could speak. Not much, just a brief statement. I looked at the cameras and said, I trusted the wrong people because they were my family. I paid dearly for that trust, but I will not let what happened to me happen to others. If anyone is going through something similar, hearing strange conversations, noticing money disappearing, feeling manipulated by their own family, do not ignore the signs. Seek help, because family is not who shares your blood. Family is who respects your life. The statement was replayed on several news broadcasts. I received hundreds of messages from people telling similar stories, thanking me for having the courage to speak out. Some called me an inspiration. I didn't feel inspiring. I felt tired, hurt, but also determined to see this through to the end. The trial was scheduled for May, 4 months later. In the meantime, my life slowly began to rebuild. The cast came off. I started physical therapy, regained my mobility. I went back to managing the bakeries personally. I reconnected with friends I had neglected. I started to live again. The house, which had been invaded by the toxic presence of Evan and Chloe, became mine again. I redecorated the room they had used, turning it into an office. I removed everything that reminded me of them, every photo, every object. It was painful, but necessary. My younger sister, Clara, who lives in Milwaukee, came to spend a week with me. She hugged me tight when she arrived and said she was sorry she hadn't noticed what was happening. I explained that I hadn't realized it myself for a long time, that manipulators are skilled at hiding their true intentions. We spent that week talking, reminiscing about our childhood, our family, the parents who were long gone. Clara reminded me of the strong woman I had always been before grief and loneliness made me vulnerable. She said that Eleanor was coming back, and she was right. When May finally arrived, I was ready. Ready to face Evan and Chloe in court. Ready to tell my full story, ready to see justice done. The trial would be long, perhaps weeks, but I wouldn't run. I wouldn't give up. Because this wasn't just about me. It was about all the elderly people who are exploited, abused, and manipulated by those who should protect them. It was about proving that being older doesn't mean being weak, and that Eleanor Hayes was not a victim. She was a survivor. The trial began on a rainy Monday in May. The courtroom was even more crowded than at the preliminary hearing. The case had gained national notoriety, becoming a poster child for how families can turn dangerous when money is involved. Chloe entered the courtroom with a completely different look. Hair pulled back, no makeup, simple clothes. It was clearly a defense strategy to make her look less threatening, more vulnerable. But her eyes, when they met mine, still burned with that icy hatred. Evan was thinner, paler, with deep, dark circles. The months in prison had taken their toll. He didn't look at me when he entered, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor. I don't know if it was shame or cowardice, maybe both. D.A. Mendez opened with a devastating summary of the case. She presented the complete timeline, from my husband's death, through the financial embezzlement, the recorded conversations, culminating in the physical assault. She painted a picture of systematic predators who had chosen a vulnerable widow as their target. When it was the defense's turn, Chloe's lawyer tried a risky strategy. He admitted she had made mistakes, but argued it had all been out of love for Evan. That she was a devoted wife, trying to help her husband solve financial problems. That the push had been an accident, a moment of frustration where she only reached out her hand, and I, unbalanced by age and medication, fell. The narrative might have been convincing if it weren't for the video. D.A. Mendez played it again, this time with analysis from a body language expert who pointed out every detail. Chloe checking for witnesses, positioning herself strategically behind me, the deliberate movement of her arms, the force applied. There was no ambiguity, it was premeditated assault. Evan's lawyer, on the other hand, stuck to the line that he was a victim of manipulation. He presented witnesses who talked about what Evan was like before Chloe, a hard-working young man, a good son, with no criminal record. They suggested that Chloe, with her experience in manipulating the elderly, had seduced and corrupted a vulnerable young man with gambling debts. It was partially true. Evan had debts before he met Chloe. But that didn't explain the laugh. It didn't explain the cruel words. It didn't explain the active complicity in every stage of the plan. He wasn't a puppet. He was a willing accomplice. Over 2 weeks, witness after witness was called. The toxicologist explained in technical detail how Chloe's previous husbands were likely poisoned. Family members of those men testified about sudden changes in behavior after the marriages, about Chloe isolating the husbands from relatives, about convenient deaths that resulted in substantial inheritances. Robert presented financial documentation that left no doubt about the systematic embezzlement. Marcus described his investigation, the photos of the secret apartment, the meetings with Julian. Every piece of evidence was another brick in the wall closing in on Evan and Chloe, eliminating any possibility of innocence. Julian, the corrupt lawyer, had cut a deal with the prosecution. In exchange for testifying against Chloe and Evan, he would receive a reduced sentence. His testimony was devastating. He described in detail how Chloe had specifically sought him out, asking for help to obtain a fraudulent conservatorship over a rich, senile mother-in-law. He recounted how Chloe had asked for recommendations for doctors willing to provide false reports and witnesses who could be bought, that the plan was to have me declared incompetent, gain total control of the finances, and then, in his words, wait for nature to take its course, with or without help. That last part caused an uproar in the courtroom. The judge had to call for order, because Julian had essentially confirmed that Chloe was planning my death, whether by waiting for it to happen naturally or by speeding up the process. When it was my turn to testify again, this time in the full trial, I walked to the stand with a steady gait. My foot had healed completely, though it still ached on rainy days. But I no longer needed crutches. I showed no more physical fragility. I wanted the jury to see me as I was, a 68-year-old woman, perfectly capable, lucid, and strong. Da Mendez guided me through the full story once more. This time, I could speak more freely, add emotional details that had been left out of the preliminary hearing. I talked about what it was like to first hear my son and daughter-in-law discussing my death, how it broke something inside me that would never be fully repaired. I talked about the fear of eating the food Chloe prepared, about sleeping with my door locked in my own home, about living in a constant state of alert, about how every smile from them, every word of affection, was like a stab, because I knew it was false. And I talked about the stares, about the second before the push, when our eyes met and I saw in Chloe's pupils not sudden anger, but cold, calculated intent. About the physical pain of the bone breaking, yes, but mostly about the emotional pain of understanding that my own son, my blood, had approved of that violence against me. When I finished, there were jurors crying softly. Some avoided looking at Evan and Chloe as if their very presence was contaminating. The cross-examination was brutal. The defense lawyers tried to destabilize me, suggesting I was a controlling mother who couldn't accept losing power over her adult son, that I was using my financial resources as a weapon of manipulation, that I had misinterpreted innocent conversations through the filter of a paranoid and lonely widow. I answered every attack calmly. I presented facts, not emotions, bank numbers, not hurt feelings, clear recordings, not subjective interpretations. It was impossible to discredit such solid evidence, but they tried. At one point, Chloe's lawyer made a mistake. He asked if I didn't think I was being dramatic, that a simple fall down the stairs didn't justify destroying 2 young people's lives with prison. I looked at him and replied, "A simple fall? My foot was fractured in 2 places. I required surgery with metal pins. I was incapacitated for weeks. And you heard the audio. The assault wasn't the fall. It was the deliberate push that caused the fall. And my son's words saying I deserved it. None of that is simple. None of that is accidental. It was premeditated violence against a 68-year-old woman by the people who were supposed to protect me." The jury looked at me with expressions mixing pity and anger. Pity for me, anger for Evan and Chloe. It was exactly the reaction the truth deserved to provoke. The trial stretched on for 3 weeks. More witnesses, more evidence, more arguments. The defense brought in psychologists trying to explain how good people could do bad things under financial pressure. The prosecution brought in specialists in elder abuse, showing patterns of behavior that Evan and Chloe had followed almost like a manual. Finally, the day of closing arguments arrived. DA Mendez gave a powerful speech about how society fails to protect its elders, about how family trust is often used as a weapon, about how justice needed to be done not just for me, but to send a clear message that this type of crime would not be tolerated. The defense lawyers made their final efforts, asking for mercy, talking about youth and second chances, about how a long prison sentence would be disproportionate to the crime. But their voices sounded weak against the weight of the evidence. The jury retired for deliberation on a Friday afternoon. They said it could take days. I went home, emotionally exhausted, and waited. Clara had returned and stayed with me, keeping me company, distracting me with conversations about anything other than the trial. The verdict came on Monday morning. The court called, saying the jury had reached a decision. My heart hammered. 3 days was a relatively short time, which usually indicated the decision had been clear, not controversial. I returned to the courthouse with Clara by my side. The room was tense, silent. Chloe stared straight ahead, her face an empty mask. Evan bit his lip nervously, his hands trembling even in cuffs. The judge entered and asked everyone to rise. The jury foreperson, a woman in her 50s with a serious expression, stood with the verdict sheet in her hands. On the charge of aggravated battery, we find the defendant, Chloe Hayes, guilty. I felt Clara squeeze my hand. On the charge of fraud, we find the defendants, Chloe Hayes and Evan Hayes, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy, we find the defendants, Chloe Hayes and Evan Hayes, guilty. Guilty. On all counts. The jury had held no doubts. Chloe remained motionless, but I saw a single tear trace a path down her cheek. Not of remorse, I realized, of anger at being caught. Evan bowed his head and began to sob quietly. The judge then moved to sentencing. For Chloe, 12 years in prison, no possibility of parole before serving half her sentence. For Evan, 8 years, with the possibility of parole after serving 1/3, given his partial cooperation and lack of a prior criminal record. 12 years, 8 years. They were heavy sentences, but they were just. Chloe would be nearly 40 when she got out. If she got out, Evan would be 36. Their lives, at least as they knew them, were over. Part of me felt a pang of pain watching my son being led away again by the officers, that maternal instinct that never fully dies, regardless of what the child does. But the larger part of me felt relief. Justice had been done. The nightmare was over. Outside the courthouse, I gave another brief interview. I thanked the justice system for listening to me, for taking the case seriously, for understanding that crimes against the elderly are as grave as any other. I said I hoped my story would encourage others in the same situation not to be afraid to report, even when the abusers are family. Today, 1.5 years after that Christmas that changed everything, I am sitting on my balcony having breakfast. The sun is warm, typical of a Chicago summer, and I can hear the sounds of the streets starting the day. The bakeries are thriving under my renewed management. I hired a trustworthy manager for the day-to-day, but I'm actively involved in the important decisions. I discovered that being forced back into total control of the businesses gave me an energy I hadn't had in years. The house is different, lighter. I redecorated almost everything, bringing in brighter colors, new furniture, plants that I let Clara take care of when I travel. Yes, I've started traveling again. I went to Hawaii earlier this year, something Richard and I always planned to do but never did. It was bittersweet to do it alone, but also liberating. I've made new friends through a support group for people who suffered financial and emotional abuse from family members. It's shocking and sad how many similar stories exist. Children who see their parents as living bank accounts, in-laws who plan inheritances before the death, grandchildren who manipulate vulnerable grandparents. I've become a sort of mentor in the group, helping others recognize the signs to protect themselves legally and financially. The will I made remains valid. Ryan, my nephew, will be the primary beneficiary when I'm gone, along with the Foundation for Disadvantaged Children. Evan will still receive the symbolic $100,000, not out of generosity, but to make it legally clear he was not forgotten, just consciously excluded from the bulk of the inheritance. I haven't visited Evan in prison. He has written to me 3 times long letters, asking for forgiveness, explaining how he got lost, how Chloe manipulated him, but that he is still responsible for his own choices. I didn't answer the first 2. The third one I received last week, and it's still on the living room table, unopened. Part of me wants to read it, wants to know what he has to say after a year of reflecting on his actions. Another part of me doesn't see the point. Words won't change what happened. They won't bring back the lost time, the broken trust, the pain I carry. Maybe one day, I'll open the letter. Maybe one day, when he gets out of prison, we can have some kind of distant, civil relationship, not as mother and son. That died the moment he laughed at my fall. But perhaps as 2 people who share a history and are trying to move forward. But not today. Today is still too raw, too painful. Today, I prefer to focus on what I've built, on the friendships I've cultivated, on the life I've reclaimed. Chloe, according to Arthur Vance, who stays in touch with the DA's office, is having a hard time in prison. Apparently, her ability to manipulate people doesn't work so well when everyone around her is a criminal who recognizes another criminal. I feel a small, perhaps petty, satisfaction in that. The investigations into her previous husbands are ongoing. There's a real possibility that formal murder charges will be filed. If that happens, she will never get out of prison. She'll be where she belongs, far away from vulnerable people she could exploit. Sometimes, late at night, I still have nightmares. I dream I'm falling down the stairs again, that I wake up and they're still in the house, that I find out too late that I've been poisoned. I wake up sweating, heart racing, and I need a few minutes to remember that I'm safe, that they are in prison, that the danger has passed. The therapist I started seeing a few months ago says it's normal. That trauma takes time to process, that the nightmares will lessen eventually. I'm starting to believe her. They are already less frequent than they were at the beginning. What did I learn from all of this? That trust is precious and must be given carefully, even to family, especially to family. Perhaps because that's where we have the most to lose when we are betrayed. That being older doesn't mean being weak or incapable, and we must never let anyone make us feel that way. I learned that it's possible to rebuild a life after destruction, that it's possible to find strength, even when everything seems lost, that justice, though delayed, still exists, and that surviving isn't just continuing to exist. It's choosing to live fully, despite what they tried to do to you. I look at the scars on my foot, still visible where the pins were inserted. Some people might see those scars as a reminder of victimization. I see them as a reminder of survival, of fighting back, and of victory. Eleanor Hayes is no longer the naive widow who trusted blindly. She is no longer the mother who put her son above all else, even her own safety. She is a woman who looked betrayal in the face, fought it, and won. And if my story can help just one person recognize the signs of abuse, to have the courage to report it, to protect themselves before it's too late, then all the suffering will have been worth it. Because in the end, it's not about the money they tried to steal. It's not about the inheritance they planned for. It's about dignity, about the right to live without fear in your own home, about justice when family turns into predators, and about proving that 68-year-old widows with broken feet can be more dangerous and resilient than criminals in their 30s can ever imagine. I finish my coffee, get up, and start my day. I have a meeting at the bakery, lunch with Clara, a painting class in the afternoon. A normal life, a good life, my life. And that is exactly as it should be. The nightmare is over, life goes on. And I, Eleanor Hayes, am more alive than ever. Now, if you like this story, click subscribe and tell me in the comments what part left your jaw on the floor. Oh, and don't forget to become a member to get access to exclusive videos I don't post here. I'll see you there.